Released in 2009, Lake Mungo is a found footage mockumentary film telling the story of a grieving family. After their daughter Alice drowns in the lake nearby, unexplained paranormal activity begins to occur in their home, suggesting her spirit may not have moved on. I chose this movie as the next part of my 52-week horror movie challenge. My prompt this week was to find a movie that is simply found footage. Obviously, the entire world of found footage is massive, right? And I've seen so many different found footage films, I didn't know where to start. But as usual, with this series, I like to find movies that I've never seen before, and this was a movie that a lot of people have recommended to me over the years. There's a lot of praise for it. I've seen the poster floating around a ton of times before, but I still knew next to nothing about it. All that I really knew is that out of the sea of other found footage films, this is one of the very few found footage movies that a lot of people actually call good. That's kind of rare. Not for me, but for most people, yes. So let's start with some positives with this film. First and foremost, this is not a copycat of Paranormal Activity. When Paranormal Activity first came around in 2009, there were so many different filmmakers out there that tried to emulate the same exact kind of success and popularity of Paranormal Activity because it was cheap to make and it was incredibly popular. However, Lake Mungo came out like the same time as Paranormal Activity, so it wasn't really trying to do the same thing. It just so happened to be another found footage movie that came out around the same time. So it makes sense as to why so many people might prefer this over Paranormal Activity. In fact, I feel like it's one of those things where you're going to maybe love it or hate it, same as Paranormal Activity, and you're going to prefer one over the other. For me, I very much prefer Paranormal Activity over Lake Mungo, and I'll get into why in a second, but for the most part, I understand where a lot of people are coming from. I understand why this movie gained as much popularity as it has over the years. So while the first positive might be that it's not a copycat of Paranormal Activity, I think the second positive is probably something that a lot more critics talk about when they review this movie, and that is the hidden ghost element of the film. I feel like when I watched this movie, this was the main inspiration for Mike Flanagan, who would later make The Haunting of Hill House, which implemented the same exact idea seen here. And that is, throughout this entire movie, there's a lot of still images that you see, which is something that's pretty average and normal for a documentary, and they are used for that exact reason. Only in the background of pretty much every single still image throughout the film, somewhere in the image is a hidden ghost. And throughout the movie, typically in the latter half of the movie, they would pull up those same images, zoom into one of the corners of the photograph, and you'll be like, oh yeah, there is something there. Was that there the entire time? And that gives the movie a rewatchability factor that maybe Paranormal Activity didn't have. That is, out of sheer curiosity, you might want to watch the movie again just to make sure the first time they show you the photograph, if the ghost is actually there, or it's something that they added in post later to mess with your head. And I think for the most part, the ghosts were always there. That is really good directing, that is really good editing, and that is really good pacing. These are all technical aspects that mess with you psychologically. I bet you in 2009 that would have been freaking awesome. However, I will say, since I saw Mike Flanagan's other stuff, primarily The Haunting of Hill House, the way that he implements hidden ghosts in the background is something that I prefer. I think that he does it way better than Lake Mungo. The third positive would probably be performances, because in the grand scheme of things, the performances in this movie are very relatable, they're realistic, they're emotional. I was actually surprised by the performances 9 times out of 10 throughout the movie, because when it comes down to found footage, what do you normally get? You get a lot of amateur bad acting. But I would also argue on purpose, because amateurism really helps the found footage stand out as, well, found footage. But because this is a documentary with asides, with people talking, you want it to feel a little bit more professional, and in that aspect, it does feel legitimately like you're either watching a documentary or some kind of news special. And throughout the runtime, there is consistently some twists and turns that I didn't expect or see coming, and I think that all of those were expertly woven into the overall narrative. Now, the movie also has a fair amount of negatives, in my opinion. I would say pretty much the same amount of positives there are negatives. First and foremost, I consider this movie to be slow and boring. It just is. That's one of the main reasons that I prefer Paranormal Activity over Lake Mungo. The narrative itself, if you're just breaking down the story, is incredibly straightforward and standard. You have a girl that dies and a haunting that happens directly after, prompting a family to set up some cameras to try to catch whatever's going on, and this entire thing is covered by some kind of documentary crew. It's the documentary crew, though, that specifically keeps things grounded. They approach everything matter-of-factly, and they maintain that slow and steady pace, which works for a documentary in general, but it's not the pace of things that you want out of a horror film specifically. For horror films, you want things to climb and climb and climb, so that when it gets to its eventual climax, things are freaking insane. However, that never happens here, because its pacing is always steady and steady and steady until the very end, where it just ends. That's not what I want out of a horror film. That's not really what I want out of anything other than maybe a documentary. Why is that a problem? Because the second negative here is that the movie is not scary. Obviously, that's going to be a pretty big problem, right? Because we're in the middle of my 52-week horror movie challenge, and what we end up with Lake Mungo, which is apparently this big, popular found footage film, you have an unscary, basically not even horror, found footage film. Instead, it is a psychological drama film that has elements that you would typically find in horror, and then those elements are approached in a way that's just bland and lacking significant tension. Pay attention to the characters in the film. At no point, to me, do they ever really act scared. They act confused, they act curious, but they never act scared. So how are you supposed to feel scared when you watch the movie when the characters in the movie themselves aren't even acting scared? I felt nothing when I watched Lake Mungo. Nothing. There's not even any rising music that you might typically find with horror films that signal to viewers that what they're watching is scary, is tense. There's an element of impending doom. Nothing. I cannot say it enough, but this movie is not scary because it's not a horror film. At the end of the day, my end score for this film is a 61 out of 100 possible star rating. That is a C letter grade. I do think that there's more technical positives in the film than there is negatives. However, when it comes down to what you want out of a horror film and what this movie offers you, it's not good enough. It's one of the lamest experiences I've had this entire 52-week horror movie challenge. We're on week 12 now. But really, that's often what you do get with found footage. More often than not, you're going to find a found footage film that isn't as good as other people say it is. Because horror is subjective. Scares are subjective. Maybe some people watch the movie and are terrified. Not me. But what about you guys, though? Have you seen Lake Mungo? Are you a fan of this one? Are you not? Are you scared by the film? Do you appreciate the technicalities but otherwise think it's kind of a boring movie? Let me know, and as for YouTube, you guys know what to do. Hit the subscribe button, like button, and bell to be notified when I come out with my next review, whenever or whatever that may be on, and until that day comes, peace out.